All right, so earlier we talked about the difference between an inference and a flaw, right? So Giovanna, what is an inference?
Oh, but was that not the question? Was that not
What is an inference?
a valid the inference is a valid conclusion.
Yes, excellent. And then what is a flaw? Ahmed, what is a flaw?
Oh,
An invalid conclusion.
Yeah, excellent. Step one. So, and an invalid conclusion means that our premises are not enough to guarantee that conclusion. So we already answered this. What even is a flaw? So essentially on the test, many questions are actually flaws themselves. There are specifically flawed questions, which we're going to talk about, but strengthen, weaken, sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, all of those question types are actually flawed arguments in the stimulus. So what this test does is it gives us a bunch of premises and a conclusion, and we have to learn how to determine why these premises don't guarantee this conclusion. And so some of the questions are flaw questions, which are just asking us, why is that not good enough to guarantee the conclusion? But sometimes when we get to strengthen questions, what it will ask us to do is to find an answer choice that if we brought in would make our conclusion stronger. Or it might be a weakened question. And it'll be like, what premise could we bring in that would make our conclusion weaker? And so we're all being able to recognize these flaws are just going to be able to help us. Does anybody know what are some of the most common flaws on the test? Any ideas? Giovanna, you got one? Oh, you're on mute.
bring it in new information.
No, not for flaw. It would be irrelevant. So some of the most common ones are like correlation causation, which is just like if two things happen at the same time, that doesn't mean that one is absolutely causing the other. We'll talk about these more as we go. I'm just talking very big picture right now. I'm actually not huge on memorizing a bunch of flaws. We'll talk about them and I'll label them when I talk about them, just so that we kind of have a vocab word for it. But I'm not like, I think some programs like have you memorize 80 flaws. I think that's crazy. But one of them is correlation causation. You'll think that see that all over the place. Another one is like conditional flaws. And so that's like whenever we confuse sufficient for necessary. So sufficient, whenever we take something that would be sufficient for an outcome and act as if it's necessary. So we talked about this when we talked about conditions, but what this would look like is if I live in the US, that's sufficient for knowing that, or sorry, if I lived in Ohio, that's sufficient for knowing that I live in the US, right?
Yeah.
So what some people might say is, if you live in Ohio, you live in the US, Nicole lives in the US, therefore she must live in Ohio. So I'm taking that necessary condition and acting as if it's sufficient. So switching those happens all the time as well. But our goal, if you watch the flaw video, he talked about this too, is we want to kill the argument. So we want to go into every single argument thinking that this sucks and we want to figure out what's wrong with it. So we want to decide, like as someone said once, he might have even said this in the video, that whenever you read the argument, think about the person that you hate or dislike the most is saying it and you just always want to prove them wrong. So who's that person that you just always want to be wrong? Think about them saying it and prove them wrong. Like what else? What are they taking for granted or presuming without providing justification? Which presuming without providing justification, you'll see this in answer choices all the time. Does anybody know what that means? Dun, dun, dun.
Without proof in the argument.
Without proof, yeah. It just means, so it actually just means assume. So they assume something. So takes for granted and presumes without providing justification just means like you're assuming something without knowing it for sure. And then fails to consider just means that you aren't thinking about all the things that could be. So if I said it's hot outside, therefore we should get ice cream. What is something that I'm presuming without providing justification?
That everybody wants to get ice cream because it's hot outside.
Yeah, that everybody, like, because it's hot outside is a reason, like everybody would want to get ice cream. Excellent. What's something that I could be failing to consider?
Not everybody likes ice cream.
Yeah, not everybody likes ice cream. Or you're failing to consider that there's other options for a treat other than ice cream. Excellent. So let's go ahead and think about like takes for granted and fails to consider, and go ahead and start with this argument. So go ahead and think about, why is this a valid argument? One, and two, if it's not, what are we assuming or what are we failing to consider? And give me a reaction once you're done.
Excuse me, can you go back to the 3 things we needed to do?
Just think about assumes or takes for granted and fails to consider. Those two, takes for granted or assumes, same thing, or fails to consider. So Tia, what are they assuming here?
That TV isn't educational. Like the person that whoever's doing the homework isn't watching Sesame Street or something.
So yeah, it's not educational, but we're also, I would say, like, we're assuming that we shouldn't do anything that doesn't help with your homework.
Oh, yeah, that too.
Even bigger picture, yeah. And then what are we failing to consider? What did you say for this, Emily?
I wasn't sure. I was thinking like how having the TV on could be helpful while you're doing homework.
Could it be
I
that the
wasn't
person's
sure.
already done with their homework?
What if, like, I was saying, like, it fails to consider that there's no reason to watch TV other than helping with your homework. Like, maybe, like, what if I said, since it won't help with the LSAT studying, you should never watch TV? Well, yeah, but maybe you watch it to relax. Like, just because something doesn't help with your homework, that doesn't mean you shouldn't watch TV, right? So we can be very nitpicky when it comes to things like that. All right, so what about this? What do we assume or fails to consider for this argument? All right, who has this one? What is this argument assuming?
That you need evidence to prove something exists. Oh wait, hold on. I did that completely backwards.
You're really close.
That you don't need evidence to prove something exists?
Well, our conclusion is it probably exists. And we're basing that on the fact that there's no evidence that it's not real. So I think it's assuming that like if it was not real, there would be evidence to prove it's not real. Right? Because we're saying there's no evidence that it's not real. What are we failing to consider?
That somebody could be lying. Oh, I'm taking more information than I need to.
Yeah, we don't know anybody's lying. What are we failing to consider?
That maybe there's evidence that shows that it doesn't exist.
But we're saying that there's no evidence that it's not real.
So, just because there's no evidence, that doesn't make it real.
Yeah, excellent, Giovanna. Like, we're failing to consider that even though there's no evidence, it still could not be real.
Right. Okay.
Excellent. All right, what about this one? Go ahead and think about this one. Failing to consider and takes for granted. Give me a reaction when you're done. All right, so what is this one assuming or taking for granted?
Is it taking for granted that wine has other stuff in it than antioxidants like sugar, maybe?
Like things that might be bad? Yeah, it's taking for granted that, like, just because it has some good things, it doesn't mean that there's not more bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Or what is it assuming?
There's nothing else that contains, other than wine, that contains antioxidants.
Yeah, there's nothing else that would make it worse for us. Excellent. Or we're assuming that having antioxidants is a good enough reason to make something a healthy diet. Awesome. All right. I believe this is the last. Oh, I have two more. All right, go ahead and try this one. All right, Jillian, what is our conclusion in this one?
But this is not true.
Yeah, this is not true. And what is our reasoning for why we're saying it's not true? Oh,
Because Qatar has a higher per capita income.
yeah, do you think that's a good reason for us to say that the US isn't the wealthiest nation?
No.
No, what is this argument assuming?
That the U.S. and Qatar have the same population or the same amount of people.
I don't think we have to have the same amount of people to be the wealthiest nation.
At a higher per capita income,
Because they,
the wealthier nation.
Yeah, they're excellent, Tia. Do you see that? She's saying that having like that a higher they're assuming that having a higher per capita income is what makes people a wealthy nation, or is what we're considering wealth based off of.
and then I was saying, just because they have a higher income, we still have more people. I mean, we have more, they may have a higher income, but we overall, since we have more people, more billionaires, we are still the wealthiest nation.
So so this argument's failing to consider, if we're going with what Giovanna said, they're failing to consider other factors that we might judge what is the wealthiest nation off of. Like, maybe a wealthiest nation isn't per capita income, but it's based off of like the lowest poverty rate or something like that.
Or the total, or our total, I want to say GDP or whatever.
Yeah, anything, right? So we're failing to consider these other factors that might contribute to being the wealthiest nation. Is this making sense as we're going through? Okay. I know it's tough, but I try to break it down so it's simpler so we can get the grasp of the concept. All right, Taylor, this one's for you. We'll give everybody 30 seconds, but this one you're going to share. All right, Taylor, what's our conclusion?
I don't know. I'm kind of confused. Everyone who boards the plane has to show his or her ticket, but I don't think that's a conclusion.
Nope, that's just a fact.
Okay, so she will be allowed to board the plane
Yes, and why are we saying that you'll be allowed to board the plane?
because I showed my ticket.
Yeah, is this a valid argument?
No,
Why not?
I mean, there could be other reasons that you may not be allowed to board.
Yeah, excellent. You're failing to consider that like maybe you're a drunken mess and you can't board the plane. Or we're assuming that I'm gonna throw in an LSAT word, that showing your ticket is sufficient to be allowed to board the plane, when really it's just necessary.
Makes sense.
Do we see that? Awesome.
So hold on, is that a fail? So was that a fail to consider other things?
Yeah,
So
we're failing to, like, the basic is failing to consider that there's other reasons why Taylor can't board the plane.
But I thought they said she did board.
Our conclusion is she will be allowed to board the plane, but our conclusion we don't have to take as true.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right, so as we move on with our flaw questions are top down. So once again, we have to stay between those lines. Our approach is going to be really similar than what we just did, but we're going to find the main conclusion. I guess we should read the stimulus first and understand. Find our main conclusion. So on those sentences, we have to find our conclusion first and understand the reasoning for it. So we can even practice saying in our own words, Taylor will be allowed to board the plane because she showed her ticket. And then we want to predict, just as we just did, why does the support not prove the conclusion? So what is it taking for granted? What is it assuming? What is it failing to consider? You don't have to answer all three of these for every question. Just pick out one of them. Some of them, like it'll be easier to do one than the other. But we really want to see that gap. Like, why isn't this 100%? And then as we go through the answer choices, what we're going to ask ourselves is, did this actually happen? So sometimes answer choices will put really fancy flaws in there that are great flaws, but it's not actually what's happening in our argument. And then we'll have to ask ourselves, is it a problem that it does that? Sometimes wrong answer choices will say something that happened, but it actually isn't a flaw and it's okay that it did it. And we need to say yes to both of those questions in order for it to be the correct answer. My advice for these is very similar as the method statement and reasoning questions, where we want to break down our answer choices part by part to understand them better. They can be, people sometimes hate, just like the reasoning questions where you're like, I don't even know what this answer is saying. This can happen a lot. And we want to replace those abstract words. So those things like it takes us like that one with Taylor and the plane, it takes something sufficient and acts as if it's necessary. We want to put concrete ideas from our stimulus of like, what is that sufficient thing? Or what is that necessary thing? Or it might say something like, it takes a phenomenon that is causally relating to another phenomenon, acts as if it is that one phenomenon is for sure causing the other phenomenon. Like we want to actually find like, what is the one phenomenon that's related to the other phenomenon? But what's the thing that's related to the other thing that we think is causing this thing? Type of thing is how we want to fill those in. Our question stems will say things like describes the flaw, describes the error in reasoning, is most vulnerable to criticism, or the argument is questionable. These are a very, very, very common question type. Sometimes you'll have 2, 3, 4 on a section. And then with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So go ahead and just read this stimulus silently and find our conclusion and prephrase what you think and the support, just conclusion and support, and give me a reaction when you're done. All right, so politician P is saying, my opponent claims that the government is obligated to raise taxes to increase funding for schools and healthcare. All right, so we're saying that this other person, my enemy, right, is saying that the government needs to raise taxes to increase funding for schools and healthcare. Because raising taxes to increase funding for schools and healthcare would make taxpayers upset over their loss of buying power, my opponent is simply mistaken. So my conclusion is my opponent is simply mistaken. And why am I saying that, Anna? Oh, is Anna still on?
Yeah, I
Sorry.
just out for a second, but yes, I did read
No,
it.
you're fine. You were like I can only see 8 of you, and so one person was hiding and it was you.
Yeah, okay. I can answer it though. My opponent is simply mistaken because raising taxes to increase funding for schools and healthcare would make taxpayers upset over their loss of buying power.
So now I want everybody to make a prediction. What is this conclusion taking for granted or failing to consider? And type it in the chat. Type your prediction in the chat. And she said it takes for granted that the government is not obligated to raise taxes because it would make taxpayers upset. Yes, we don't have to care that what makes taxpayers up. Just because we hurt someone's feelings, that doesn't mean the government doesn't have to do something. And so we're putting way too much value on their feelings. And do we see that? Or we're assuming that taxpayers' feelings are more important than funding for schools and healthcare.
Oh, okay.
Can we kind of see those gaps there?
All
right, go ahead and try this one and put your answer in the chat. All right, so if I was going through these answer choices, this is how I would approach it. So presupposing that a claim is mistaken, or like, so assuming that a claim is wrong on the grounds that the person defending the claim advocates other unpopular views. So do we say that that my opponent is wrong by showing that that person defends other unpopular views? So does that
Yeah.
happen?
We don't know.
Nope. So we're going to cross that off. It doesn't happen. I think I have another slide where I have my 2 questions. I should have had this. Sorry. Does it happen? Nope. So we're crossing that off. B, do we assume that a claim is false on the grounds that the person defending it is of questionable character?
No.
Do I say that my opponent has questionable character? Nope. B says concluding that a view is false on the grounds that its implementation would lead to just unhappiness. Yeah, that's it. Like, this is almost too easy of an answer, right? Does it happen? Is that a problem that I'm basing it just on people's feelings? Yes. D says appealing to wholly irrelevant issues to deflect attention away from the real issue. No, I would say people's feelings are at least relevant. They're not wholly irrelevant. And then E says insisting that an obligation exists without offering any evidence that it exists. So what obligation am I insisting exists for people that selected E? A couple people picked E. So if we fill this in, what would be the obligation that we are insisting exists?
The funding, I didn't pick it. I didn't pick it, but maybe they're speaking of funding or government funding, maybe.
Well, we're saying my opponent is wrong. So is the obligation, I mean, maybe we're saying that the obligation is to not make taxpayers upset, but do we not offer any evidence? We do have some evidence. So the fact that we have some evidence, that makes E wrong. And so that's why our answer is C.
Yeah, I was in between C and E because I was like, well, am I focusing too much on the emotion versus obligation? And then I got all confused. But
No, you're no, and you're gonna miss a lot of flaw questions by narrowing it down to 2. And so in your review and your wrong answer journal, what I just did there, like trying to figure this out for myself of plugging it in, is going to be so helpful.